So these notes, we're going to talk about the slope formula. So remember when I said in the last lesson that slope, which we use the variable m, represents rise over run, and we said rise was the change vertically, which is the y's, if you think up and down vertically. And remember, change was delta, so it's delta y is the vertical change, over, well, the run is left and right, which is the x's, is delta x, or the horizontal change. Okay, now there's a really easy formula if you're given 2 points instead of a graph to be able to basically find the change in y and the change in x just by subtracting. Now, I could give you the really complicated, hard to understand formula, or at least initially. Later on, as you get used to notation, it won't be so hard. But the way I like to write it is to calculate your slope. Remember, this is just, when I say calculate slope instead of count, there's no graph, okay? So when you're given 2 points, you can calculate your slope. Actually, instead of no graph, I'm going to just say when you're given 2 points. I'm going to put PTS for points, okay? So the way I like to remember it is delta y over delta x. That's the easiest. Change, if you remember in the last, maybe you picked it up, maybe you didn't, it's okay. Change, we always find by the difference. Well, don't we, so the difference in the y's over the difference in the x's. Well, when we find difference, remember way back to the very, very beginning, we translated difference as subtraction. So basically, I just remember you subtract the y's over, you subtract the x's. And then it doesn't really matter the order, okay? At the end, I'll give you the formula that's more of like the formal formula, okay? But if you just remember, you subtract the y's over you subtract the x's, but you just have to remember that the subtraction is in the same order. And this is what I mean. So for number 1, the 2 y's are 1 and 3. And I'm underlining the y's once to kind of indicate that we have to do the numerator first, which is the y's. Kind of like we said, the vertical change is always, we do the y's first when we do slope. So then I'm going to write it as 1 minus 3 over, and now I'm going to underline both x's twice because that's our second thing, or do it on the denominator. 1 minus 4, well, 1 minus 3 is negative 2 over 1 minus 4 is negative 3. All we have to do is divide out the signs. Negative divided by negative simplifies to a positive 2/3 slope. So when I say the order matters when you subtract, notice we started with the first point y minus the second point y. Then on the bottom, we started with the first point y minus the second point y. So if we start with the first point for the y's, we have to start with the first point in the x's, okay? In fact, that's what x1 and y1 means. It just means the x of the first point, the y of the first point, x2, y2, that just means x of the second point, y of the second point, okay? And these are subscripts, they're not exponents. Subscripts are just notation. Kind of like those of you that did the extra credit for the arithmetic sequences where the subscript told you the position of the term. That's the same idea, okay? Now, I want to do number 1 using the other order, okay? Again, remember how we counted slope in 2 different directions? Like, for example, on number 5 from the previous notes, we went up 5 first and then right 5. So we got this, 2 positives to get our positive 5/3. But we could also go from the top, we could go down and left, which is 2 negative directions, and still we know a negative divided by negative still gives us our positive. So subtracting the y's in the other order, so like if I do the second y, which is 3, minus the first y in the numerator, and then the x from the second point, 4, minus 1 which is so the second point x minus the first point x, 4 minus 1, I end up getting 3 minus 2 is 2 over 4 minus 1 is 3. I get the exact same answer, I just don't need to reduce. There's no quick way to find out, at least in my experience. I just like what's going to give you a negatives or positives that you have to simplify. I don't know. I just choose one way to subtract and stick with it, so it just becomes automatic. I like to do the first point minus the second point, so I just keep that same order all the time. Some people prefer to do the second point minus the first point, but if you do that, you got to be consistent and subtract the x's and y's in the same order. So let's look at number 2. To find our slope, first thing we do is subtract our y's in the top, so 4 and negative 2. This negative is separate from the subtraction. So we have to write it as 4 minus negative 2. Remember when we substitute in negatives, we use parentheses? Same thing here. Then, and I'm not even going to simplify it. I know some of you are itching for me to do that. I just want you to first set it up, then simplify. So now we have all the x's. And since I started from the first y, I have to start from the first x. So negative 2 minus 10. Well, now that I simplify it, 2 negatives make a positive. 4 plus 2 is 6. Negative 2 minus 10, if you want to do your KFC, keep, flip, change, it's negative 2 plus negative 10, which is negative 12. Now, we know a positive 6 divided by negative is going to give us an overall positive slope, but 6 over 12 we can simplify, so we want to divide out a 6. Well, 6 divided by 6 is 1. Negative 12 divided by 6 is, oops, did I write it as positive? Oh my goodness. All right, positive divided by negative, we know we get a negative answer. So this part where if I do negative 12 divided by 6, I already have the negative because there's only one negative. So our answer is negative 1/2. Okay. Now, just for those of you, I'm just going to do it for this problem. If you prefer to do the second point minus the first, we would have negative 2 minus 4 for the y's over, and if we started with the second point, we have to, for the y's, we have to start with the second point on the x's, 10 minus, and then this negative 2, we got to protect and not lose our negative. You don't want to lose your negative by substituting it in with parentheses. So if you want to do KFC, keep, flip, change, go ahead. Negative 2 plus negative 4 is negative 6, which is the same thing as negative 2 minus 4. And we can do the same KFC, keep, flip, change, or just think of 2 negatives make a positive. 10 plus 2 is 12. And yes, a negative divided by a positive is negative, and I can just reduce it by 6. So I get 1 over 2. And remember, I already took into account the negative here, okay? So it's really, really simple. Now, what do we do if we get a 0 in the numerator or denominator? Okay. Well, remember these from our previous notes. If you get a 0 in the numerator over any other number, it just equals 0. If you get any number over 0, then it's no slope whatsoever. Okay. So this is what we're focusing on. Okay. These two examples. So let's look at number 5. Okay, so we start with we start with the y's. So we have our two y's, 9 minus 9, and I'm starting from the first point minus the second. So I have 5 minus 3 on the x. Well, 9 minus 9 is 0 over 5 minus 3 is 2. Now remember, 0 over any number, that's this case. 0 rise over any number for the run up to infinity. So this just simplifies to 0. I'm just going to write the word 0 so that nobody gets confused by my 0. Okay, so next one I want to look at actually is number 12. So if I start from the first point minus the second point, I always have to start with the y's because we do vertical with slope first. So 6 minus 8 over 4 minus 4. Well, 6 minus 8, you could do your KFC or just know that it's negative 2 over 4 minus 4 is 0. Well, automatically, as soon as I see that 0 in the denominator, I think of this case. Any number over 0 is going to be no slope. One way I think of it as 0 cannot hold up any numbers. So either you can write no slope, or you can say that this equals no solution, which basically means no slope. Okay? So it would have been the same thing going from the second point minus the first point. I'm just not going to do that. I did problems 1 and 2 in both directions. But what I want you to do is go ahead and stop the video and go ahead and find your slope for the problems I didn't do. Okay, and then pause the video and check. And then we're going to So this part, we're reviewing a big lesson we had back in quarter 1 when we were solving multivariable equations, okay? So, like for example, here we have 2 variables in every equation, and in order to convert them to slope-intercept form, first you have to understand what that is, okay? Well, slope-intercept form is always y equals mx plus b. Well, the m is the slope, or your rise over run. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a second, some more. The b is your y-intercept. Well, if you remember intercepts, it's basically where the line crosses the y-axis. Okay, so before we get over here and review solving multivariable equations, that's basically what we're doing so that we get y all by itself. That's how we get it into slope-intercept form, okay? But before we do that, let me show you how easy writing this equation is when we know the m and the b. And then later on, you're actually going to be given a graph where you have to count the slope and then just name where the y-intercept is, and you can come up with the equation y equals mx plus b really, really quickly and really, really easily. There's almost no work once you get really good at counting slope. And with the equation, we never ever have to write the whole number slope as a fraction. We only write it as a fraction when we have to count it on or graph a line, okay? So since our slope is 2, we have y equals 2x, because remember slope is your m, and since the y-intercept is your b, and since it's -1, instead of plus b, we just do -1. Basically, the b tells you whether it's going to be plus or minus for the last term. So for number 2, you have y equals, well, our slope, or the m, which always goes next, multiplied by the x, is -3/5 x, and then the y-intercept, which is your b, is +4. Well, since it's +4, we do +4. Okay. So then really quickly, I'm not even going to write these anymore. I just know the slope is the m, so it's -3m. The y-intercept is 2, so it's +2. I just put +2. So number 4, now because our slope is -1, we could write it as y equals -1x. Oh, I just noticed up in number 3. Yes, the m is -3, but it's -3x. The m is always multiplied by the x, okay? And we're going to talk more about that later and why that's so important. But sorry, back to number 4. So the slope is -1, so m times x, and then our y-intercept is +7, so we do +7. But remember, we've talked about how -1x is the same thing as a -x, and remember, we're at the point where the -x is more sophisticated and higher level thinking than writing the -1. It's okay to write the -1 until you get confident enough to just say, oh, well, I know that -1x is the same thing as -x, okay? Now, look at number 5. See how the slope is 1/4? So we have y equals 1/4 x, because the m, which is your slope, always is multiplied by x. Now, since the y-intercept is 0, I don't even have to write +0. Because if I write +0, it's kind of like the -1x. This isn't simplified further because the +0 isn't going to change the 1/4 x, so we just write it as y equals 1/4 x, and this is the most correct answer. There's nothing wrong with this, it's just not simplified. Kind of like this, it's not wrong, but it's just not simplified. Okay. So then number 6, we just write y equals, well, our slope, -5/2 x, and then our y-intercept -3, so it's just -3. Okay. So we talk about standard form, and that's when the x's and y's are on the same side. Notice on slope-intercept form, the y is all by itself on the left-hand side, okay? We're going to end up changing these into the y equals mx plus b, just like we've done in the previous lesson last quarter, when we were solving multi-step equations, okay? So we'll review that in a second. Standard form is ax plus by equals c, okay? So standard form just means that the x term and the y term are on the same side of the equation, okay? So like 2x plus y equals 3, the a is 2, the b is 1, and the c is 3, okay? But we're going to convert them, which basically means solve for y. So this part right here means solve for y. In other words, get y all by itself on the left side. Okay. Maybe I'll just make this a note. Okay. Well, to get y all by itself, we need to get rid of the x term. So first thing we always do is eliminate the x term, which usually is subtracting the x term unless the x is negative. So I'm going to subtract 2x on both sides. So that gives me the y all by itself on the left side. Now over here I have a positive 3 and a negative 2x. These are not like terms. I cannot combine them. But the x term has priority over the b term, which is the constant, so I'm going to write it as negative 2x plus 3, since the 3 is positive. Here's my final answer. I didn't have to divide anything because 1y is the same thing as just y, and that's what we need to solve for. Now here I know, because there's a 5y, my last step I'm going to have to divide everything by 5, but because we always work backwards on GEMDAS when we solve, we need to always get rid of or eliminate the x term to the other side. So in this case, we subtract 4x on both sides, so we get 5y equals negative 4x minus 30, because we always put the x term has priority and comes first, then the b comes second. Now I just divide everything by 5 and simplify what we can. It's okay if your if your slope is a fraction. We're used to that. In fact, when we graph them, we want it in a fraction. So you get y equals negative 4/5 x minus 6. Okay. So let's do one more. And then I'm going to have you do these 3 on your own and then pause it and check the answer key. So number 3, we want to get rid of the x term first. So we're going to subtract x on both sides. But remember, when we subtract, notice the negative is on the 3y. I'm going to circle those just so you see. That's why I subtracted x, because it was actually a positive 1x. And that's why I do the negative x on both sides. That's how the x terms eliminate on the left. So I'm left with negative 3y on the left side. And then over here, I just rewrite it as negative x plus 12. And again, it's because the 12 is positive. Okay. Now I just divide everything by negative 3 and reduce. And what I mean by reduce, like here it's 1y, but I'm just going to write it as y. And here I reduce it as a negative divided by a negative. And this is where I want to write in that 1. Because a negative divided by a negative is positive, and that's a 1/3 x. I want to separate the whole slope, the whole fraction. So the numerator is the coefficient of the x, which is 1 after we divided out the 2 negatives. And then the denominator was 3. And then notice right here, I'm going to circle the plus 12 and over the negative 3. This is really important. A lot of people miss this. You have to first reduce the slopes, reduce the signs. Positive divided by negative is negative, 12 divided by 3 is 4. Okay? This is one of the biggest mistakes that I see is people aren't simplifying the signs correctly. Okay, so pause the video and do 4, 5, and 6 and see how you do. Bring questions to class.